Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we will talk about logging in ASP.NET Core, and actually this is a getting started video into ASP.NET Core logging, an introduction. And my hope is that this would be one of the clearest explanations that you would get about how logging actually works and how it is designed in ASP.NET Core. Because let's face it, probably most of you already know exactly that we have some kind of magic that we can use and inject loggers wherever we want them, and we can then just simply use them to log different things, and this is correct. But in order to really understand, or in order to be able to build upon this type of foundation, to add some custom logging, structured logging, understand logging providers, logging sinks, and things similar to that, it is important to understand how actually this logging infrastructure is set up in ASP.NET Core, and that's the main purpose of this video right now. So this means that there will be a lot of other videos coming very soon. So you might just want to hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that already, because you want to be posted whenever we have new content regarding ASP.NET Core logging. And I can assure you that we will go into a lot of topics when it comes to logging. We will also look into other third-party logging providers like Serilog, like Nlog, like Log4net, and so on. So you might want to really keep in touch on this one if you are interested, of course, in ASP.NET Core logging. Now let's get right into it. And I would like, first of all, to just make sure that we all have really a common understanding or baseline about how we use logging in ASP.NET Core. I just want to get started on implementing and logging some information, which is very easy. The project that you see here is actually a project that we have built when we created a video on how to structure the layered architecture. So if you want to better understand the layers of these applications that are expressed in different projects, then you might just want to just go to that video. You'll see a card with this video in the right top corner on this video right now, and you will also find it in the description of this video. So you can pause that, go to the other video, and try to understand exactly what we have here. Because right now I just want to concentrate about logging. And as said, the good thing, or a very good thing about logging in ASP.NET Core is that it actually works without the need for us to do anything. We can just simply start use the logging features that we have in ASP.NET Core without even configuring anything. So let's see a little bit how this is done. First of all, of course, we will need here a private field. So we'll go for private read only, and we'll inject here an ILogger. Now, the cool thing about the logger is, let's first name the field and then we'll go into this discussion. The interesting thing about this ILogger is that it is just a service that is already there in the dependency injection container, so you can just inject it. And as part of this ILogger interface, you have different methods that you can use to log different type of things that you might want to log. For instance, if you want just to log some information, you can log information. If you have in your application, or if you reach a state, for instance, where things are not as they should be, then you might want to log a warning. But if your things get really messy and you have exceptions, then you might want to log exceptions. So everything is part of this ILogger interface, and we will look into that just in a second. However, right now there is one important thing that I want to emphasize, that this ILogger interface is a generic one. And we usually put here as a generic type parameter the name of the class in which we actually do the logging. So in this case, it would be our weather forecast controller, because we do the logging in our weather forecast controller class. Seems very easy and straightforward, so no big deal here. Now, the idea is that we will see just in a second, when we will launch the application, exactly why this is important to specify here this generic type parameter. And we'll see exactly that we can actually individuate and see exactly where we did the logging, or what class did the logging of that specific log that we are looking to. Now, let's also, for instance, we have already here in the constructor of this controller, this ILogger of weather forecast service. So the only thing that we need to do here is we can say logger equals logger, and then we should be good to go. Now, here we use a service. We have moved all the weather forecast retrieval in a service, and there below the service there is a repository. So it's a regular structured application. But right now, what I want just to do is let's log something here, logger dot, and we see that we have here the different type of logging that we can do. We can log information, which is simply just an information that we want to log, to have it somewhere. We can log debug. This is then maybe used when we are debugging, just to log different things or different states of objects. Then we have log error, and we use this one when we have exceptions or errors in our application. So when the application reaches a state that cannot actually go forward, and of course we just want to log this, and we log this as error. Then we have trace, which is even more verbose than the debug. And we have the warning, as said, when something is a little bit fishy in the application, but it's not quite an error. So in this case, we can just log a warning, and that should do it. Now let's start very simple by having a log information. And here we can, for instance, let's make a string interpolation. Let's say controller action executed on, and date time dot now, and let's use only the time for this, or time of day. Good, so this is what we log here. Now we can also refactor this a little bit. We just want to get a result first, so let's have here var result, because what we want to do here is of course we need an equals here. We just also want to log how many objects did we actually get back from the service. So in this case, once again, logger log information, and let's also use once again string interpolation, because I really like it, and say we got, and then we can get actually the count of the result.count forecasts from the service, which is cool. And then we can simply return result, and that should do it. Our application should be up and running again. Now let's run the application and look a little bit into what will happen when we will execute the controller, or when we will execute from Swagger an action to this controller, when we will try it out. So we have here the console. Now on the other monitor we have this, the Swagger open. I won't bring it here because I want us to keep focus on what happens in the console. So I'll click on try it out and execute right now. And I can already close Swagger. We don't need it anymore. So what happened here? Well, it happened here that when we started the application, we got some logs that come from Microsoft. These logs come from ASP.NET Core directly. So we haven't even logged them, but an external library has logged them for us. But then we see that we have these two log informations, and here we see that we got, so the controller action executed on, and we see exactly the time, and then that we got 5 results back, which is fairly cool. But I want us to take a closer look about how actually the name of this logger looks like, because we have here, for instance, weather forecast API controllers, which is actually the name of the project. This one is the name of the project, and this is the name of the folder where we are, and this is actually the name of the class. So this here is actually the name that we specify here when we define the ILogger and when we inject the ILogger in our constructor. And this is very important, because you will log, and we will actually do this, we will log into different classes. And in that case, we want for each log to have a better overview where exactly did that logging happen. And this is how you can do it. So it's very easy. Now, in fact, let's enhance our logging that we have right now and do exactly that. So let's move here into our service class. We have this weather forecast service, which is in a total different layer of the application, which is the services layer. And of course, we also want to log what happens here. So in this case, we would also need to add the ILogger. So we'll have private read only. And in order to be able to see exactly from the console, in this case, where exactly did this logging happen, we can just specify that this is an ILogger of weather forecast service, because this is where our logging happens. And let's call it logger, and that should be okay. Now, the only thing is, and in fact I wanted this to happen, is that of course we are here in a class library project. We are not in the ASP.NET Core project anymore. So in this case, our class library does really not know exactly where to look for logging. And in fact, if we click here on this light bulb, we see that we have here this hint to install the package Microsoft Extensions Logging. And actually, this is what we want to do. So let's install this. Let's install with Package Manager. Okay, and here we have this one, which is the latest stable version. We'll choose the latest stable version, and that should then work. So once again, if you want to log actually, or to use the logging that we have already in ASP.NET Core, but in other class libraries, so meaning in other layers of your application, because your API or your web application, it's actually just the front end, but you would have probably a lot of different other types of layers. Then you would have to install this package, Microsoft Extensions Logging Abstractions, which provides you actually with this ILogger interface. So now we can see here using Microsoft Extensions Logging, and that should do it. So this is a very, very first key point here of this video. If you want to use the ILogger in your class libraries that actually represent different layers of your applications, you have to install the Microsoft Extensions Logging NuGet package. Otherwise, you can't really do that. But once you have done that, it's actually very, very easy, because you can say here, once again, I want through the dependency injection container an ILogger, which will be here of type weather forecast service, and let's call it logger. And here where we actually also assign the repository, let's also assign the logger. So now once again, just as we did in our controller, we have a fully functional logger directly into our service. And since we have registered this service in our dependency injection container, like here, services add scoped iWeather forecast service, and the logger is also part of the dependency injection container, even though we don't need to add it manually, ASP.NET Core does this for us. This means that when we reach here this constructor, the dependency injection container will just simply provide us an instance of an ILogger that will use this generic type param. And here we can then just again, for instance, use it exactly the same way that we used it in our controller. So logger.log information. And here we will just use a simple information like maybe also getting data from the repository. So now we get the data. Then we start another step here. We can just log another information for that. Logger.log information. And here we can simply say that start processing the forecasts. And then we actually do that. And then we can maybe just log once again, logger.log information. And here we can say, for instance, that returning results to the caller. So that should be it. So now we have added a few bunch more of logging here. Once again, the most important thing right now, we are doing logging in a class library. And for that, we had to install this Microsoft Extensions Logging NuGet package. So that's a very, very important thing. But once we have done that and everything is wired up with the dependency injection container in ASP.NET Core, everything should work just fine. So let's once again run our application. Swagger opened on the other monitor, but once again, we really don't care about that. Let's just try it out again. And here we see that we get a bunch of more logging. Here we get from our controller, and we see that it is from our controller because this is from the generic type param. And then we see that we have this from the weather forecast service. This is once again from the weather forecast service. And this is also from the weather forecast service. And this log is once again from the controller. So this is why the generic type params for a logger are important, because it really helps you to better understand exactly which class did the logging of this certain log. So that is really, really important. Now that's fairly cool and everything seems to work very, very nice. Let's here just for a demo purpose add some other type of logs. Let's, for instance, logger.log warning. Here we can just say this is a warning. And then we can, for instance, even say here logger.log error. And theoretically here we should provide also an exception. And we can say here new exception. And then demo exception. So that would be okay. Let's just run the application again. And we will, okay, no, we have errors, of course. Expected, okay, we need a semicolon here. And that was a typo. It was a colon instead of a semicolon. So let's run the application again. Once again, Swagger will open on the other monitor. We will execute and we'll see exactly how the warning and the error are displayed in the console here. And we did execute. Things are done here. So let's see what happened. You see that we have here the warning that comes still from the weather forecast controller. And we see that it is colored actually in yellow, and the error is actually labeled here with fail, and it's colored with red. So this is how we actually see that this is info, this is warning, and this is actually an exception. And we see here some more information about the exception, but in our case, it was just a very plain and default exception object, so there's not much to see here. But once again, the main idea is that logging here just works. Now, actually, for the coding part, I would say that well, that's fairly easy to implement. Really, this is no big deal, but I think it is very, very important in order to understand then more advanced topics about logging and providers and things and structured logging and a lot of different things. We need to have a better understanding about how actually this logging works in ASP.NET Core. And actually, it's very, very easy. It's not complicated at all. And if you think it's complicated by reading some of the documentations, then I hope this video will make it clear for you. And here we have actually 4 main classes or concepts that we actually use or that define exactly what or how logging actually works in ASP.NET Core. And as we have seen, we have a library, which is the Microsoft Extensions logging library that contains all the logging infrastructure. Now, if we are in an ASP.NET Core application, we already have this library, so we didn't have to install it. But as you have seen, when we wanted to actually use an ILogger in another layer, which was actually a class library, so a dedicated project, we needed to install this. So wherever you want to use this ILogger, you need to install it until or unless it's actually an ASP.NET Core application where it comes by default. And then there are really 3 concepts or 3 fundamental concepts to logging in ASP.NET Core, and actually that's it, so nothing more than that. So first of all, we have this interface ILogger of T that we have already used, so it's not really complicated. It's simply just a logger that is a named one and that provides actually a type T for it. And all logs that are sent to an ILogger of T will have then the logger name of that specific assembly and then of that specific class. So it will have actually the fully qualified name or the full name of it. Once again, this is important because it really helps us to better understand by which class was each log generated, and that could really help us a lot when we do some bug investigation or troubleshooting or things similar to that. Now, I use the terminology that the type T actually defines the name of the logger, but in the Microsoft documentation, you will often see the terminology category. I really prefer to use name because it's easier to grasp and to understand what this T is all about, because it's there to just provide us with a named logger so that we know exactly which class did a certain log. So that's basically it. And then we have the concept of an ILoggerProvider, which is another interface. And actually, this is a type that provides ILogger instances. Now, the idea is that it's actually not just that. It provides ILogger instances for a specific logging system. So when you hear this concept of logging provider in ASP.NET Core, it's actually nothing else than a word that defines a certain logging environment or a logging system. And this is important because by default in ASP.NET Core, we have 4 different log providers. We have a provider for the console, which provides us with the capability to write logs in the console, the logs that we have seen when we ran this application. Then we have a provider for debug that actually writes logs in the debug console. We have also a provider, a logging provider for the event source system. And we have then another provider, another logging provider for the Windows event log. So this means that theoretically logs that we actually capture by default should also be there in our event log on our operating system if we are on Windows. This is important. So this brings in this concept of having providers, because each destination for your logging should be or is or has, of course, its own very specific characteristics. So we cannot simply use just a generic provider that will write logs everywhere. No, we simply can't do that. So instead we have this concept of providers that actually are targeted to work with a certain logging system. And that's it. And those 4 systems that you see here are actually, as said, already built in ASP.NET Core. And then we have the ILoggerFactory, which is actually the mastermind that brings everything together, that wires everything together. It actually, it has a collection of ILogger providers, and we can add logger providers to the factory. And then it can create loggers that are associated to those logger providers. So when we say that we need an ILogger of T, what happens behind the hood is that we have this ILoggerFactory that actually tries to create loggers for all the providers that are currently registered. So actually this keeps track about what providers are there, and the factory makes sure that each provider will have the correct log instances so that we can consume and really start logging. And this is how, or because of this ILoggerFactory, it's actually possible for us that we can actually log it only once, because we just log this information once, this other information we log it only once. So we do not do a logs or we do not do dedicated logs for each provider. So we don't do, for instance, here a log for the console and then separately a log for the event log. No, we just log it once, because the ILoggerFactory made sure that all the providers that were registered have these loggers that they need in order to able to log the information or the warning or the error that we actually want to log. So that's actually it. But before we really go into this, let's bring here also a whiteboard, because I also want to give a basic understanding on how this, what we discussed right now, is actually a foundation for understanding basically or virtually everything about logging in ASP.NET Core. So let's start to draw a little bit here. So we have here something, and this is the ILoggerFactory. So ILF, sorry, my drawing. And as said, the ILoggerFactory, or we can register different logging providers to this ILoggerFactory. So we would have here, for instance, an ILoggerProvider, and let's say here I, L, and P for provider. And here we can have for the console, for instance, console. And then we'll have another ILoggerProvider. And this ILoggerProvider, for instance, is for, let's say, ILoggerProvider. And this ILoggerProvider is for the event log. So let's see, event log. And then maybe we have another ILoggerProvider. As said, we have totally 4, but we will draw here only one other. So let's have here ILP, ILoggerProvider, and this provider is then for, let's say, for debug. Okay, so we have this provider. Now, each of these providers could have different loggers, and the ILoggerFactory, whenever you need a logger, is responsible to create all the different loggers that each provider needs in order for you to be able to log. So this means that this provider would have, for instance, here an instance of a logger, which could be, for instance, I don't know, for our controller, but it could virtually have several different loggers for the different classes that we would actually need to log. So this is why also our naming is important and how we use the generic type param. Now, then we have for this provider, it's exactly the same thing. So we have here a logger, which is cool. And let's say that for this one, we have also one other logger. And once again, the very, very important thing is that all these loggers are actually created by this ILoggerFactory. So this one is created for this one. So the factory actually keeps in track of all the providers that it has, and then for all the different loggers that each provider actually needs. And this is how logging in ASP.NET Core works. Now, why is this important? Because most of the times the logging that we have built in here, or the providers that we have built into ASP.NET Core, are not enough for real logging when we think about production applications. And that's why we usually use different type of third-party logging libraries like Serilog or Log4net or nlog. So what happens if we want to use one of those libraries? And once again, I talk here very conceptually because each third-party logging provider does this type of things a little bit different. But generally, what I'm about to show here actually is a general concept that works, in my opinion, for all of them. So let's say that right now, so this is the standard logging setup that we already have in ASP.NET Core. So this is nothing that we influence right now. So let's say that we want, for instance, to be able to log to a file. And we cannot do logging to a file with the providers that we have by default. So in that case, let's say that we want to add Serilog to our application. Serilog, as said, is a third-party logging provider. So what this actually will do is that to this ILoggerFactory, we will actually add a new provider. And this provider would be Serilog logging provider. So we will also add it to the ILoggerFactory. And as we add this provider to the ILoggerFactory, it will get, of course, the different instance of loggers that it actually needs to provide the logging infrastructure. So we have one logger, we have potentially another logger for a different class, and things similar to that. Now, how Serilog, or how this logging provider is writing the logs to a file, ASP.NET Core doesn't care, or the ILoggerFactory doesn't care. The ILoggerFactory is just responsible to provide loggers to the provider, and then how the provider does the magic behind on reaching out to a logging system, well, it's the job of the provider to define this type of low-level behavior. But once again, the important thing is that if we want to add a third-party logging library, we need to actually add a provider to our ILoggerFactory. And in this case, this provider, the LoggerFactory will now know that instead of 3 providers that it has, or 4 providers that it has by default, it has then right now a 5th one, which is Serilog. And then it does its job, and it makes sure that whenever Serilog or this provider needs a logger, it makes sure that it will have all the logger instances that this provider needs in order to do the logging. So, and if we would like, for instance, to add another third-party logging provider like Log4net, we would have to do exactly the same thing. So we will have to add that provider to the LoggerFactory, and then the LoggerFactory would make sure that that new provider would get all the necessary loggers when it needs to log something. Now, one last very important thing here is that usually, as said, we can have several different providers that work in parallel. However, third-party logging libraries might have different approaches, because some of the libraries, when you add the logging provider for their library, they actually remove all the default providers that are provided there by ASP.NET Core. So you have to be a little bit careful for that, but we will go into more detail about this once we will talk about those specific logging providers for ASP.NET Core. Good. And I guess that's actually it for today. I hope you found this content useful. As said, this is just a getting started video into how ASP.NET Core logging works, and I can promise you that there will follow more and more videos about logging in ASP.NET Core, from very easy concepts to more advanced concepts, until we arrive even at structured logging and things similar to them, or maybe even creating our own logging abstraction for our own class library. That could also be a topic. But if you want to be updated on that, then just please hit the subscribe button if you didn't do it already, and so you can make sure that you get always the latest information and the latest content that we try to provide here. And if you enjoyed it, also hit the thumbs up button. That would be very much appreciated. And if you think that you might have friends or colleagues or peers that might also benefit from this one, don't be shy again and send them. Spread the word. Sharing is caring, they say. Last but not least, if you have any questions or ideas, or if you just want to add something, don't be shy once again and just use the comment section, because we have it here and I'm really more than happy to start a conversation going with you. So I am waiting for your comments. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.